Millionaire lets a desperate girl doctor live in his house. When he comes back, he is shocked by what sees. Noah Callahan was a man whose life seemed to have been sculpted by perfection. His success in the real estate market had earned him immeasurable wealth and an enviable status in New York City. But none of it mattered when compared to what he considered his true treasure: Helena, his wife and soulmate. With her, Noah had planned a future filled with adventures, love, and sunlit summers on a paradise island he dreamed of turning into an exclusive retreat for the two of them. Everything changed in a split second. A curve on the road, a car spinning out of control, and Helena's life was brutally taken. Noah, who had been driving that fateful night, survived. But something inside him died with her. Guilt, pain, and an overwhelming emptiness became his constant companions. He tried to maintain appearances in the first few months, but the pressure of facing a life without Helena soon became unbearable. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Suddenly, the things that once made sense, business meetings, glamorous parties, the bustle of the city, became intolerable. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fill the void she had left behind. Every corner of his luxurious New York apartment echoed with her absence. The walls suffocated him, and even the gleam of his wealth seemed to mock his grief. So he decided to disappear, to abandon everything that tied him to the past. He summoned his assistant and his executive manager and said, "I'm leaving, and anything business-related should go directly through the team. I don't pay high salaries for nothing. They're capable, a team of excellence. I don't know when I'll be back. Only call me if it's absolutely necessary. I don't want to be disturbed." He left without looking back, seeking refuge on an isolated island he once dreamed of turning into their private paradise. Now it was a gilded prison. The mansion perched on the cliffs, with windows facing the infinite ocean, only seemed to amplify the silence of his solitude. The nights were the cruelest. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks was a relentless reminder of the vastness of the world and how alone he was in it. Noah spent hours sitting on the veranda with a bottle of whiskey at his side, staring at the horizon as if waiting for the sea to bring back something, or someone, that could restore his will to live. The island was alive, vibrant, but he refused to see it, even after years of being there. The green of the trees swaying in the wind and the sun's shimmering reflection on the water were mere blurs in his vision. The only sound that seemed to bring him any peace was the ocean, the same sound he had shared so many times with Helena. Now it was a bitter companion, a reminder of what had been and what would never be again. Meanwhile, back in New York, there was a woman, Sophie Martin, who had spent much of her life believing that love and compassion were enough to change the world. As a doctor, she devoted herself completely to her patients, working long hours and often ignoring her own limits. Her passion for medicine was a legacy from her parents, who had also dedicated their lives to helping others. But the course of her life changed drastically when she lost a young patient, and something inside her shattered. The scene replayed incessantly in her mind. The monitors beeping, the silence that followed, and the crushing sensation of failure. Sophie began questioning everything: her competence, her career choice, even her worth as a human being. The voices in her head were relentless, filled with self-criticism and guilt, despite everyone around her insisting she had done all she could. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she made a drastic decision. She needed to step away before losing herself completely. She decided to take a sabbatical year and return to the island that held her best childhood memories. The seaside house her parents had left behind was a refuge she had never had the courage to sell, even when Noah Callahan, the millionaire who had purchased nearly the entire island, offered her a small fortune for it. When Sophie arrived on the island, she found the scenery almost untouched. The beach where she had walked barefoot as a child was still there, the sound of the sea bringing a bittersweet mix of nostalgia and sorrow. She knew Noah lived in the mansion on the other side of the island, but it mattered little to her. He was a distant presence, a man she knew only through stories, the reclusive, eccentric billionaire. The first time Sophie saw Noah, she was walking along the beach with Max, her loyal canine companion. The dog was joyfully running through the sand while she gazed at the horizon, lost in thought. Noah stood on the mansion's veranda, a still figure against the gray sky. Sophie waved politely, but he turned away and disappeared inside, as if avoiding any interaction was his top priority. She felt his indifference and thought it might be resentment for her decision not to sell the house to him, but she chose to ignore it. After all, she wasn't there to make friends. She was there to silence the voices in her head and regain her inner peace. However, the island seemed to have other plans. Each solitary walk along the beach brought her closer to the mansion, where Noah remained like a shadow, watching from afar but never approaching. The tension between them was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an invisible string pulling them toward an inevitable interaction. Sophie, however, was determined to focus on herself. If Noah Callahan wanted to isolate himself from the world, she wouldn't be the one to disrupt his exile. Still, there was something in his gaze, even from a distance, that intrigued her. Sophie's routine on the island followed an almost monotonous rhythm, but there was something therapeutic in its simplicity. Every morning, she walked barefoot along the beach, feeling the cool sand under her feet. Max, her golden retriever, ran along the shore, barking at the waves as if challenging the sea. Watching him play made her smile, even if only briefly. It was a small relief from the weight she carried in her chest. She often brought a book but rarely read it. She preferred to sit on a rock near the water, watching the horizon and letting the sound of the waves soothe her. Sometimes, tears would fall unexpectedly. Other times, she managed to take a deep breath and find a glimmer of hope. Noah watched her. He never planned to, but from his veranda, his eyes were inevitably drawn to her figure on the beach. At first, he thought her presence was an intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. But over time, he began to notice the details. The way she closed her eyes and let the wind tousle her hair, or how she played with her dog, laughing softly, as if trying not to disturb anyone. It was as if Sophie was grappling with something larger than herself, something he couldn't ignore. He felt an inexplicable irritation. Who did she think she was? Strolling along the beach as if everything was fine, as if this island was just a park? But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. What bothered him wasn't her presence. It was the fact that, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't look away from her. Sophie, in turn, noticed him too. Always discreet, Noah was a distant but constant figure. She tried to break the ice with small waves or polite smiles, but he never responded. Instead, he would vanish from sight, as if even the simplest interaction was an inconvenience. One time, as she threw a ball for Max, she felt his gaze more intense than ever. Turning, she found him on the veranda, arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a moment, and Sophie felt a shiver. Not of fear, but of something harder to define, curiosity mixed with the sense of being seen by someone who looked beyond appearances. Sophie began to feel that Noah wasn't just the recluse the island had made him out to be. There was something in his rigid stance, in his heavy gaze, that spoke of something deeper. But he didn't seem willing to let anyone get close. That didn't matter. She wasn't there to invade anyone's life. At least that's what she told herself. That night, a storm arrived on the island like an untamed beast. The sky, once gray and calm, became a battlefield of lightning. Cutting winds howled through the trees, ripping leaves free and scattering them like desperate ghosts. The ocean waves roared against the cliffs, echoing like cries of lament. Noah Callahan watched the scene from the veranda of his mansion, a glass of whiskey in one hand, the other resting on the wooden railing. The chaos around him seemed to mirror the emptiness he carried inside. Each crack of thunder splitting the sky reminded him of life's fragility, of how quickly Helena had been taken from him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the now slanted rain soak his face. 3 years, he murmured to himself, as if the words held some power. 3 years since she'd been gone, and he still felt as lost as he had on the first day. Every wave crashing against the rocks seemed to mock his inability to move forward. Noah gripped his glass tightly, the creak of the glass beneath his fingers barely audible over the storm, as the tempest around him made him feel small and insignificant. On the other side of the island, Sophie Martin was at the mercy of the storm's fury. The small cabin where she lived trembled under the force of the winds. The window groaned as if it might shatter at any moment, and Sophie struggled to light the last candle she had. Her hands trembled, whether from the cold or from desperation. She wasn't sure. The flame finally came to life, casting a flickering glow throughout the cabin. It was a small victory in the midst of the darkness. As the storm raged on, something shifted in Noah. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a restlessness, a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. He looked out toward the horizon, in the direction of the island where he knew Sophie lived. The thought of her alone in that cabin, facing the same storm that seemed intent on consuming everything around them, gnawed at him. Sophie sat on the floor, her back against the wall, watching the restless dance of the flame. The storm outside was a mirror of her own mind, a whirlwind of emotions, fear, and regret. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She needed to find something to hold on to, some reason to keep going. When she opened her eyes, she murmured to herself, "I'll find a new purpose or die trying." The words, spoken softly, echoed in the solitude of the cabin like a promise. In that moment, something shifted. The storm continued to howl outside, but Sophie felt a thread of determination begin to grow within her. It was fragile like the flame of the candle, but it was there. She pulled Max closer, wrapping her arms tightly around the dog. He looked up at her with loyal, understanding eyes, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. When the storm finally began to calm, the island seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But with no electricity and food supplies running low, Sophie realized she would have to make a difficult decision. She needed to ask for help from someone who had ignored her since the day she arrived. Sophie walked the narrow path leading to Noah's mansion, Max by her side, alert to every sound. When she finally spotted the mansion, its imposing presence made her hesitate. The tall windows and gray stone walls stood in stark contrast to the surrounding vegetation, giving the impression that the house was a fortress, an extension of Noah himself. Sophie took a deep breath before climbing the steps to the front door, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Noah watched her approach on the security camera installed at the gate. He felt a mixture of irritation and concern. On one hand, he wanted to maintain his isolation. On the other, he knew Sophie wouldn't come to him without a real reason. When he opened the door, his expression was cold and calculating, the kind of look he used to keep anyone from invading his solitude. Sophie, despite Noah's frosty demeanor, stood her ground. She explained that her cabin was without electricity and that she needed help to get lanterns and perhaps some supplies. Max let out a low growl, sensing the hostility in the air, but Sophie calmed him with a gentle gesture. Noah listened in silence, his expression unreadable. There was something in Sophie's tone that disarmed him. It wasn't a plea for charity. It was the vulnerable admission of someone who, like him, was trying to survive their own personal hell. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded and invited her inside. The interior of the mansion was as grand as Sophie had imagined, but there was a shadowy aura to the place. The scent of aged wood, the heavy curtains blocking out natural light, and the imposing furniture seemed to conspire to create an oppressive atmosphere. Noah retrieved a few lanterns and handed them to her without ceremony. "This should help," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "If you need anything else, let me know." Sophie thanked him, but as she turned to leave, something made her pause. She looked at Noah, and for a moment, the silence between them was almost tangible. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone a mix of genuine concern and curiosity. Noah stiffened, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "It's none of your business," he replied curtly. Sophie lowered her gaze, unwilling to push further. She took the supplies and left, but the question she had asked seemed to hang in the air, a discomfort Noah couldn't shake. He closed the door but stood there for a few moments, staring at the wood as if searching for answers in the emptiness. As Sophie walked back to her cabin, she felt a mix of relief and unease. The man she had just met was an enigma. Noah Callahan spent the night wrestling with his restlessness. Ever since Sophie had left the mansion, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had thanked him, with a genuine smile that felt out of place in such a lonely, desolate environment. He felt uneasy about how coldly he had treated her, but he didn't know how to be any different. It was how he survived, by keeping the world at arm's length. Yet something about that woman persisted in invading his thoughts. The image of her walking along the beach, the firmness in her voice as she asked for help, and the crushing silence she would take back to her cabin. Noah sighed, closing his eyes tightly. He knew what he needed to do, but that didn't make it any easier. Sophie sat on the small sofa in her cabin, wrapped in a thick blanket, with Max lying at her feet. The storm had passed, but the dampness still clung to the air, and the lack of electricity made the place feel even gloomier. She stared at the candle flickering weakly in the room, the weight of solitude pressing down on her chest. A sudden sound made Max perk up his ears. Someone was knocking on the door. Sophie rose slowly, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, she found Noah standing there, a lantern in his hand. The light cast dramatic shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and the seriousness in his eyes. "You need more than lanterns and candles," he said bluntly. "It's not safe to stay here without electricity. Come to the mansion, you can stay in one of the guest rooms, they're private. Tomorrow we'll call someone to fix your problem. Once it's safe, you can return to your home." Sophie was surprised by the offer. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a bother." "You're not bothering me," he replied with a faint smile that softened the rigidity of his expression. The two walked back to the mansion, and as Sophie packed up the few belongings she had brought, Noah realized that the idea of having company wasn't as unbearable as he had imagined. When they arrived, Noah opened the door and motioned toward a guest room on the upper floor. "It's simple but has a bed and a private bathroom. If you need anything, I'll be in the living room." Sophie looked at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. "Thank you. Really. You didn't have to do this." "Good night, Sophie," Noah said, ignoring her thanks as he headed down the stairs without waiting for a response. Noah's mansion, which once felt like an oppressive and isolated place, began to take on a new dynamic with Sophie's presence. Noah avoided prolonged interactions. He provided the essentials to make her comfortable: fresh linens, towels, and access to the kitchen, but maintained a carefully calculated emotional distance. Sophie, in turn, respected his boundaries. She spent most of her time walking around the island with Max or reading on the veranda, soaking up the island's beautiful sunlight. One evening, the dining table was set simply, but the gesture carried symbolic weight. Sophie had improvised a dinner using what she could find in the mansion's pantry: pasta, dried herbs, and wine. Noah entered the room with slow steps, wearing a black shirt that contrasted with the cautious expression on his face. He hesitated when he saw the table set but said nothing. Sophie noticed his gaze and broke the silence with a smile. "I hope you don't mind. I thought a proper meal would be better than sandwiches in the room." He gave a soft smile and said, "It's been a while since I've had a proper meal." They sat down and the conversation started on a superficial note. Neither of them shared many personal details. Despite the tension that lingered between them, there was something comforting about the simple act of sharing a meal. When they finished eating, Sophie got up to admire a nearby bookshelf. There were only a few decorative items, but one caught her attention. A framed photograph of a smiling woman. Helena. Sophie pointed at the picture, her smile faint. She's beautiful. Your wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Noah froze, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the wine in his glass. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and Sophie realized too late that she had struck a raw nerve. Noah, I'm sorry. I didn't know. No, the word came out like a thunderclap, sharp and harsh. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with force. You didn't know, and you shouldn't have asked. Sophie stood frozen, her eyes wide as he strode across the room, his fists clenched. I didn't bring you here to dig into my past. If you can't respect that, maybe it's best you go back to your cabin. His words felt like stakes driven into Sophie's chest. She took a deep breath, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. That wasn't my intention. It doesn't matter. You're right. I'll leave. She left the room quickly, heading upstairs. In her room, she began packing her things, with Max restless at her side, as if sensing that something was wrong. Tears started streaming down her face as she threw clothes into her bag, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. Noah, however, remained in the dining room, his body tense and his gaze distant. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, but the initial anger was quickly being replaced by something worse. Guilt. He knew Sophie didn't deserve his outburst. She had only asked a question he still didn't know how to answer for himself. After a few minutes, he heard her footsteps descending the stairs. Sophie carried her bag in one hand, Max's leash in the other, and avoided looking at Noah as she crossed the foyer. Sophie, he called, his voice lower now, almost pleading. She stopped at the door but didn't turn around. I was an idiot, he continued, hesitating. Please don't go. It's still hard for me to talk about her. I know that's no excuse, but just please don't leave. Sophie slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were glistening with tears, but her expression was firm. You can't treat people like that, Noah. Not everyone is trying to hurt you. He nodded, disarmed by her penetrating gaze. I know. I'm sorry. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie let out a heavy sigh. All right, but only if you promise to try to deal with this. I'm not here to become another unpleasant memory in your life. Noah felt something inside him shift. I promise. She stepped back inside with Max, leaving Noah relieved but deeply unsettled. For the first time in a long while, he realized that he might need Sophie more than he was willing to admit. Noah hesitated in front of the guest room door. He had never been good at apologies, and this one was particularly difficult. He knocked twice, softly, and heard Sophie's voice from inside. Come in. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, with Max sleeping beside her. Her eyes were red, but her expression was calm. When she saw him, Sophie raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for what he had to say. I came to apologize, Noah began, running a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. It's complicated for me, I figured, Sophie replied in a neutral tone. But you need to understand that it doesn't give you the right to treat people like enemies. I know, Noah sighed, sitting down in a nearby chair. It's been so long since I talked about her. Helena. Just saying her name feels too heavy. Sophie tilted her head, studying him. Sometimes, talking is the only way to lighten that weight. He was silent for a few seconds, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. Helena was everything to me. My best friend, my partner, the only person who made the world make sense. Losing her was like losing myself. I bought this island for us to build something together. But when she was gone, all of it lost its meaning. Sophie felt a pang in her chest. She moved closer slowly and sat beside him. Noah. No one can fill the void left by someone we love. But that doesn't mean you have to live trapped in that emptiness. He looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. How can you talk about this with so much certainty? She gave a sad smile. Because I'm also trying to find a reason to keep moving forward. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie stood up. Wait here. I'll make us some tea. While she was in the kitchen, Noah allowed himself to relax. Something about Sophie made him feel it was safe to let his guard down, even if only for a moment. When she returned with 2 cups of tea, the familiar scent stirred a dormant memory. It was the same tea Helena used to make. He didn't say anything, but Sophie noticed his reaction. Is everything okay? She asked gently. Yes. It just reminded me of her. In a good way, she nodded, handing him a cup. Maybe it can remind you that she wouldn't want to see you like this. Helena seemed like someone who wanted the best for you. He smiled, a small but genuine smile. She was. Sophie placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, May I? All your tension is right here. Before he could answer, she began massaging his shoulders with firm yet soothing movements. Noah hesitated at first, but gradually he relaxed. Sophie spoke softly, almost like a therapist, explaining how grief was different for everyone but that confronting it was essential to moving forward. Noah felt tears begin to fall, silent and unrestrained. It wasn't a cry of despair but of release. When Sophie finished, she sat beside him again, handing him a tissue. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse. For this, for everything. No need to thank me, she replied with a smile. Just drink your tea. You'll feel better. They sat there in silence, side by side, gazing at the faint glow of the candle. For Sophie, that moment was a reminder that her profession, her kindness, and her ability to listen had value. She took a deep breath, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in months. For Noah, it was the first time in years that he felt he could begin again. After a while, Noah turned to her. And you? What are you doing here, alone on this island? Sophie hesitated but then smiled, realizing it was time to share her story. Maybe I need help just as much as you do. She smiled, lowering her gaze. I know what it's like to lose hope. When I decided to come here, I was at my limit. Everything felt lost. Medicine was my life. When I lost my patient, I felt like I had completely failed. Like maybe I wasn't good enough to save anyone. Those voices are still there. But you're helping me see that life goes on. Maybe we can help each other. He smiled and said, You're stronger than you seem. Sophie thanked him, saying, I just need time to calm my soul and take care of myself. But after today, I'm certain I want to go back to the profession I love so much. Noah was amazed by everything Sophie had shared, seeing in her a truly special woman. The night was clear, the sky painted with thousands of stars that seemed to dance above the ocean. The cool breeze carried the soft sound of waves breaking in the distance, and the mansion felt more welcoming under the silvery light. Sophie and Noah sat side by side on the veranda, a shared blanket draped over them to ward off the chill. Max lay nearby, breathing peacefully, as if sensing that the moment should not be disturbed. How long has it been since you just looked at the stars? Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Noah glanced at the sky and then at her, offering a small smile. Years. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Both were lost in their own thoughts, but there was something reassuring about each other's presence. Sophie, moved by an impulse, rested her head on Noah's shoulder. He tensed for a moment but soon relaxed, allowing her to stay. Thank you for this, Sophie murmured, closing her eyes. For listening to me. I should be the one thanking you, he replied softly. It's been a long time since I've talked to anyone like this. As Sophie drifted off to sleep on Noah's shoulder, he looked at her with an unexpected tenderness. There was something about this woman, her quiet strength and the kindness that seemed to radiate from her, that made him feel something he thought he had lost forever. Thank you, he whispered, gazing up at the stars. I needed this. Carefully, he adjusted her on the sofa, tucking the blanket around her. He stayed for a few more minutes, watching her sleep, before rising and heading to his room. For the first time in years, Noah felt that there was something waiting for him beyond the emptiness, something that was beginning to blossom alongside Sophie. Noah was awakened by something he hadn't felt in a long time, a comforting and familiar aroma. He breathed deeply, eyes still closed, as the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the salty breeze wafting through the window. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. When he descended to the kitchen, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Sophie stood with her back to him, Max by her side, preparing a breakfast that looked like something out of a painting. Toast, fruit, juice, eggs, everything was arranged with care on a table that, until now, had only served as a placeholder for emptiness. "Good morning," she said without turning, as if she already knew he was there. "Good morning," Noah replied, his voice husky from sleep. He lingered for a moment before asking, "Is all this for us?" "Yes," Sophie said with a soft laugh. "I didn't know what you liked, so I made a bit of everything." Noah stood there, watching her for a few seconds before stepping closer. "I don't know what to say. How about, let's eat?" Sophie suggested, turning to him with a warm smile. "Come on. I made all of this with love for us." They sat down and began to eat, their conversation flowing lightly and effortlessly. Noah talked about the storms the island faced, and Sophie shared childhood stories, reminiscing about the happy days she spent there with her parents. Between occasional laughter and the gentle sound of waves outside, the tension that had once hung between them seemed to be melting away. After they finished eating, Sophie suggested a walk on the beach. Noah hesitated, but something in her smile made him agree. Max ran ahead of them excitedly as they strolled side by side. The wet sand beneath their feet and the rhythmic sound of the waves created an almost hypnotic backdrop. "Did you know the island was this beautiful when you bought it?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. "I did," Noah replied, looking out at the horizon. "But I don't think I ever really saw it. Until now." Sophie turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, they just walked in silence, until Noah, almost without thinking, reached out and took her hand. Sophie stopped, looking at their intertwined hands, her heart racing. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gently squeezed his hand, a shy smile forming on her lips. "That was unexpected." "For me too," Noah admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But it feels right." They continued walking, now with their hands joined. For Sophie, that small gesture spoke volumes more than words could. For Noah, it was the first step toward something he was only beginning to understand but already knew was important. A few days passed, and Noah sat on the living room couch, staring at the phone in his hand as if it were a ticking bomb. His assistant's call had left no room for choice. He needed to return to New York for a few days to sign critical documents. Despite the urgency, Noah hesitated. The thought of leaving the island and Sophie was harder than he had expected. Sophie entered the room and noticed the tense expression on Noah's face. "Is something wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. He sighed. "I have to go to New York. Business. But I don't want to leave you here alone." Sophie smiled, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not as helpless as I might seem, Noah. Go. Take care of what you need to. It's important for you to get back to your business. Your life needs to move forward. I'll handle everything here. I've already called the electrician again to fix your house. But you know how things work around here. It's always slower. Don't worry. You can stay here as long as you need. I'll head to New York, but I hope it's only for a few days. I'll bring back more supplies for the house. If you need anything, just let me know," he said. "Thank you," she replied, genuinely grateful. "And don't worry, just come back soon." The 3 days in New York were the longest of Noah's life. He completed his obligations mechanically, barely able to focus. His mind constantly drifted back to the island, the mansion, and Sophie. It was strange, almost unsettling, how she seemed to occupy every one of his thoughts. Each time he looked out of his office window and saw the bustling city below, he felt an overwhelming desire to return to the refuge he had found by her side. Meanwhile, Sophie was determined to repay Noah's kindness. The mansion, though elegant, felt oppressive. It seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. So she got to work. She cleaned the windows to let in natural light, organized the books in the library, washed linens that had been stored for far too long, and opened every door to let fresh air circulate. In the kitchen, she discovered utensils that had never been used and arranged them neatly. In the garden, she pulled weeds and rearranged the plants, breathing life into a space that had been neglected. Max followed her every move, as if silently approving of her changes. While she worked, Sophie found herself missing Noah more than she had expected. There was something about him, maybe his raw honesty or the pain he carried, that made her feel less alone. He wasn't just the reclusive millionaire. He was a man struggling to rebuild himself, just like her. When Noah finally returned, it was already night. The light at the mansion's entrance was on, something he didn't recall leaving that way. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the scent of something fresh, clean. He looked around and immediately noticed the changes. The air felt lighter, the furniture more inviting, and the glow of candles in the main room gave the space a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. In the center of the room, Sophie stood with Max by her side and a warm smile on her face. "Welcome back." Noah stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. He felt something tighten in his chest, something that wasn't sadness but a softer, almost unfamiliar emotion. "What did you do here?" he asked, his voice low. "I just did a little organizing," Sophie replied, shrugging. "I thought the place could use a bit of life." Noah set his bag down and slowly approached her. "You've brought more than life to this place, Sophie." "Thank you," she smiled. "Are you hungry? I made something simple for dinner." Noah nodded, realizing that, for the first time in a long while, it felt like he was coming home, not to an empty mansion, but to something real. And it was all because of her. The table on the veranda was picture-perfect, illuminated by candlelight and adorned with small flowers Sophie had found in the garden. The aroma of freshly prepared food mingled with the cool night air. A gentle breeze carried the sound of waves breaking in the distance, and the stars seemed brighter that night. When Noah came downstairs for dinner, he stopped for a moment at the sight. Sophie, wearing a simple white dress that flowed with the wind, was finishing setting the silverware. Max lay nearby, looking as relaxed as the atmosphere itself. "This is incredible," Noah said, breaking the silence. Sophie looked up at him and smiled. "I thought you deserved something special after these hard days." They sat down and the conversation flowed naturally. Noah was more at ease than Sophie had ever seen him. He shared funny stories from his youth, drawing genuine laughter from her. Sophie, in turn, talked about how summers on the island had shaped who she was, reminiscing about the happy moments she'd spent with her parents. When dinner ended, Noah stood up and lit a few more candles on the veranda. He grabbed a bottle of wine, poured 2 glasses, and connected his phone to a small speaker, which began to play soft, enchanting music. Sophie watched him, curious. "What are you doing?" "You went through so much trouble to prepare all this," Noah said, extending his hand to her. "Now it's my turn. Dance with me?" Sophie hesitated for a second, surprised, but then she took his hand. He pulled her gently, and the two began to sway to the music, facing the ocean. The closeness was both unsettling and irresistible. "You're a good dancer," she said, trying to ease the nervousness she felt. "My mother taught me," Noah replied with a faint smile. "She said women don't trust men who can't dance." Sophie looked at him, deeply moved by his words. Noah held her as though she were something fragile but infinitely precious. When their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. Slowly, Noah leaned in and Sophie, without thinking, met his lips. The kiss was gentle at first, as if both were testing whether this was real, but it soon grew more passionate, full of emotion. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie was breathless, and Noah had a small, contented smile on his face. He stepped back and took something from his pocket. "While I was in New York, I thought a lot about you and what you mean to me. I bought this because I thought it was time to take a step forward." He opened a small box, revealing a necklace with a star-shaped pendant. "Sophie, will you be my girlfriend?" Her hand flew to her mouth in surprise, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yes, Noah. Yes." He fastened the necklace around her neck, and the two embraced under the stars, the sound of the ocean providing a perfect soundtrack. In that moment, they both knew they had found something they hadn't expected but desperately needed: each other. The following months were a whirlwind of change. Sophie returned to medicine with a new perspective, feeling more confident and balanced than ever. Her sabbatical hadn't just been a break, it was a rebuilding. Every day with Noah reminded her of the value of her profession and the strength she carried within herself. Noah, in turn, resumed his real estate empire with a renewed vision. He no longer wanted to simply build structures. He wanted to create homes, places that held meaning for people, just as the island had come to mean for him. Sophie often accompanied him on his travels, but they both knew their true home was on the island. Their wedding was simple yet magical. Only close friends and family were present, gathered on the small beach where Sophie and Noah had shared so many meaningful conversations and moments. Sophie wore a light dress with details inspired by the sea, and Noah was more relaxed and joyful than anyone had ever seen him. Max carried the rings in a small, improvised collar, drawing laughter from the guests as he trotted down the aisle toward the pergola adorned with flowers. When they exchanged vows, there were no elaborate promises, just sincere, heartfelt words filled with emotion. "You brought light into my world when I believed darkness was all that was left," Noah said, holding Sophie's hands. "I promise to honor the strength you've shown me and walk by your side, wherever life takes us." Sophie took a deep breath, holding back tears. "You helped me remember who I am and find a reason to move forward. I promise to be your partner through every storm and every sunny day." When they kissed, the ocean waves seemed to celebrate with them, and the guests erupted into enthusiastic applause. The years that followed were filled with ups and downs, as any shared life would be. But whenever they needed a fresh start, they returned to the island. There, amidst the sound of the sea and the glow of the stars, they found everything they needed: peace, love, and a reminder that the scars of the past did not define them. On the veranda of the mansion, now brimming with life and memories, Sophie and Noah often watched the sunset together. He held her hand, the star-shaped pendant always gleaming around her neck. "Not even the best screenwriter could have written this, huh?" Sophie joked, smiling. "Maybe not," Noah replied, kissing her hand. "But I think destiny did an exceptional job." They laughed as the sky shifted colors, reminding them that just as every day comes to an end, there would always be a new dawn. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.